In 1883, a new game hit the market and swept across America and England, quickly becoming one of the most popular board games of the Victorian era. What most people didn't know is that it was essentially a ripoff of another game. But today, there's no evidence that this other game ever existed. The Strange History of Halma, this time on The Gaming Bench. To play, you need a Halma board and pieces. The pieces tend to be pretty small because the board itself is big, 16 by 16 squares. Or you can do what I did and go all in and build a massive board. If you want to see how I built this board, there's links in my description to my build videos. Traditionally, there are 19 black pieces and 19 white pieces. These are used for the 2-player game. For the 4-player game, green and red pieces are added, and all 4 players use 13 pieces each. The rules are simple. The goal of Halma is for a player to move all of their pieces from their starting position, called a camp, into the camp of the player directly opposite. All pieces move the same. On a player's turn, they can move a piece in one of 2 ways. The first is a step, where a piece moves 1 space in any direction, diagonally or orthogonally. The second is a leap, in which a piece jumps over any piece, their opponent's or their own, to land in an empty space on the opposite side. Leaps can also be done in any direction. 2 important things. First, unlike most short leap games, jumping over your opponent's piece does not result in a capture. In fact, pieces never leave the board. A leap is simply a way to advance a piece. Also, leaps can be chained together, like in checkers or drafts. The jumping piece can change directions between the diagonal and the orthogonal with each leap. They just can't change the landing spot mid-leap. Creating a chain of pieces that allow rapid movement across the board is called building a ladder. Once a piece reaches the enemy camp, it can't leave the camp, although it can move around within the camp itself. To prevent rules lawyering, many sets outline a spoiler or occupation rule. That is, victory is defined as all spaces being filled in your opponent's camp, either with your pieces or your opponent's. This prevents a belligerent player from leaving a single piece in their camp, preventing you from occupying it completely. There is a beautiful chaos as 4 players all rush to the center at once, creating a bunch of ladders and avenues of advancement. Halma is so well designed, you might never know it was essentially a copy of an earlier game called Hoppity. Or was it? George Howard Monks, the creator of Halma, was born in 1853 in Boston and grew up to become a true Renaissance man. He studied medicine and was a well-respected thoracic surgeon and lecturer at Harvard. He enjoyed a wide variety of hobbies, including writing, sculpture, and, of course, board games. In 1883 or 84, accounts vary, Monks' younger brother, Robert Hatton Monks, was traveling in England when he saw a game being played called Hoppity. Knowing his brother's fondness for board games, he wrote to George and described the game. The elder Monks, seeing the possibility in the game, reportedly either was inspired by Hoppity or outright copied some of the game mechanics to create his own board game. Monks specifically changed the rules and gameplay just enough to ensure his game didn't infringe on the copyright for Hoppity. At this time, Monks was working with Thomas Hill, a mathematician, Unitarian preacher, and later president of Harvard. He was also Monks' father-in-law. Hill, who was well versed in ancient languages, suggested the name Halma, which is Greek for jump. Halma was first published in America in 1885 by the E.I. Horseman Company, which up to that point primarily sold dolls and doll clothing. The game was a smash hit right out of the gate, so much so that the Horseman Company began referring to itself as the Halma Company. Period advertisements for Halma are just fantastic. This one shares that Halma possesses remarkable fascination for children as well as adults, and includes a testimonial from the Reverend Lyman Abbott, who says, "Halma has afforded my wife, children, and guests a great deal of quiet entertainment." Quite the recommendation. This ad announces that H is for Halma. It's a source of delight from morning till night, for we play it together in all sorts of weather. We know that Monks copyrighted his game in 1888, but for reasons that aren't clear, Milton Bradley also claimed the rights to Halma. Eventually, Milton Bradley either lost in the courts or just gave up the fight and began publishing their own knockoff version of Halma called Eka. But even with a killer name like Eka, the game never took off. Spear & Sons was the first publisher of Halma in England, starting production around 1893. Apparently, the concept of jumping a piece without a capture was so alien to the British that this rule needed to be explained, then explained again. In Everybody's Book of Indoor Games, published in the mid-1890s, the author writes, "In the game of draughts, when a man is jumped, he is removed from the board, and hence some old draughts players have been unable to believe that it is not so in Halma, although the contrary is plainly stated in the rules." A notable advancement of the game was the introduction of Stern-Halma in 1892 by the German game and puzzle company Ravensburger. Stern-Halma, that is Star-Halma in English, was the first time the game was changed from a square for 4 players to a 6-pointed star suitable for 6 players. Gameplay was exactly the same as traditional Halma, other than each player having 10 pieces instead of 13. Interestingly, George Monks, who had allegedly sold the rights for Halma to Parker Brothers years previously, didn't care for this new iteration of the game. He hired a Boston legal firm to protect his interest. However, in the end, he was, quote, too much of a gentleman to press his clear rights, end quote, and ultimately dropped the case. In 1928, J. Pressman and Company began printing their own version of Star Halma in America, which they called Hop Ching Checkers Game. Later, they would change the name to Chinese Checkers to capitalize on America's growing fascination with everything Far East. Pressman was the first to use marbles instead of the typical pawns for their game. Not coincidentally, Pressman owned their own marble factory. One of the things I find most interesting about the history of Halma is how the game Hoppity is always referenced as the inspiration for the game. But there are no existing copies of Hoppity to be found. In fact, there's no evidence that Hoppity ever existed. So, how do we square this with Monk's creation story? I have 3 theories. Theory the first. Hoppity was an impromptu game made up on the spot. Imagine 2 people growing tired of playing checkers and deciding to turn the board 45 degrees and assembling their pieces in a triangular formation just to make it interesting. Then saying, this time you can jump over a piece, but it stays on the board. My siblings and I did this any number of times on boring rainy days. Admittedly, this was before the internet. Theory the second. Hoppity was an established game commonly played on the board of another game. This was extremely common throughout history. For example, the game we know as backgammon was just one of many tables games played on the same board of 4 quadrants containing 6 points each. In fact, one of my reference books listed the rules for no fewer than 24 games played on this exact same board. Theory the last. Hoppity was a traditionally published game. Someone bought it at a shop, brought it home, and happened to play it in front of the younger monks. This is a theory I believe, and let me tell you why. All the reference books I've read that relate the story of Robert Monks telling his brother about Hoppity mention how Monks changed the rules and play of Hoppity sufficiently so as not to infringe on the copyright of Hoppity. Now, if Hoppity was just an impromptu game or a folk game, why would Monks have fretted about copyright? So the next question is, why don't I just look up the English copyright for Hoppity? Well, as you might imagine, record keeping was very different in the 1800s, and as far as I can tell, there isn't a comprehensive, searchable online database of English copyrights. And even if there was, I'm not certain I'd find Hoppity. Lost records or sloppy organization aside, there's no guarantee that Hoppity was ever copyrighted. Sure, Robert Monks saw the published game and understandably assumed it was copyrighted, but maybe it wasn't. Remember, at this time, most board games weren't produced by huge game companies. Milton Bradley, the man, had published his first game only 20 years prior, and the Parker brothers formed their company the same year that Robert Monks was telling his older brother about Hoppity. At the time, most games were produced by small companies or individuals working with print shops to bring their idea to life. I find it completely plausible that someone invented and printed a small run of Hoppity games, let's say 100. Finding limited success with their game, the inventor sold what he could and never returned to the game. The few customers who bought Hoppity must have found it not worth saving, and all these copies ended up in the trash or sold for pulp to benefit the English war effort. Halma was widely played in England and the United States in the 19th and 20th centuries, often finding its way into pop culture. For example, in James Joyce's Ulysses, published in 1920, Halma is mentioned in a list of parlor games, which also included dominoes, tiddlywinks, chess, backgammon, and something called Beggar My Neighbor. The English newspaper comic Rupert Bear, in a 1920 strip, shows Rupert having an alarming encounter with Halma pieces. He slips inside with ease. "I want a box of Halma, please." Now Rupert stares as in a dream. "Your Halma men, how big you seem." And in episode 9 of the original radio series of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Eddie, the cheerful computer of the Heart of Gold, suggests a game of Halma to calm the crew as they face certain death by the approaching Vogon fleet. Parker Brothers published Halma in America until 1961, and as far as I can tell, there are no current American publishers of the game. Even so, it's hard to overemphasize just how popular Halma was, and in many parts of the world, still is. The goal of Halma is to move your pieces across the board as quickly as possible. The most efficient way to accomplish this is to create ladders that allow pieces to make multiple jumps in a single turn, sometimes moving them the entire way across the board and into the enemy's camp. There are some drawbacks though. The biggest danger is that since pieces can jump any other piece, your opponent can use your ladder as easily as you can. Also, it takes time to create an entire chain of pieces and usually have to spend precious moves bringing a piece to the foot of the ladder and then moving them out of the way on the other side to make room for the next piece. You can create blockades of multiple pieces to stop your opponent's advance, or at least make them waste time moving around it. These blockades can be mobile, allowing you to advance a block of pieces across the board all at once. This can be slow going, but forcing the other players to make moves they don't want to may make it worthwhile. A combination of ladders and blockades is often the best strategy, as it allows you to move some pieces rapidly across the board while stifling your opponent's movement. Finally, watch out for stragglers, either near your camp or those that have been forced outside the beaten path due to enemy blockades. Once a piece is stranded without a ladder, their movement is painfully slow and can cost you the game. And that's Halma. Even though the rules are simple, there is some strategy involved, and I find this just a ton of fun, especially when 4 people are playing. So if you made it this far, I hope you'll like and subscribe. I put out new videos every week, one on the rules, history, and strategy of an ancient game, and one showing you how to build your own version. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time on The Gaming.